Cinema is a matter of what's in frame and what's out. Martin Scorsese. I wanted to start off with this quote simply because my capstone is all about representations of race in media, specifically movies. I took a class about race, trauma, and cultural memory in film, and this really sparked my interest in this project as a whole. That class, I learned a lot of new concepts that I had never heard about before, and it really impacted my ability to analyze films a little bit in more depth and better understand that representations are really complex in films, and there's reasons why certain representations prevail over others. And so as an active media consumer myself, I feel like everyone should have a certain level of analysis going on in their head when they're consuming any sort of media. Films, especially because of the fact that, there are things that are hidden and left out of films that are also important to these representations, but what is the reason why these aren't being shown to the audience? And so, as filmmaking is extremely strategic, in the way that it chooses to present an argument to the audience, it's important that audiences also kind of understand that the way that they receive the argument is ultimately impacted by the ways that they're able to understand the culture and the world around them, and the ways that these representations in film oftentimes are an extension of their own understanding of the world. So as a whole, movies definitely impact the way that someone understands, interprets, and processes certain concepts throughout history, specifically representations of race. And so I wanted to discuss some of the problems with representations of race in film, and so I chose to analyze a scene from The Blindside as well as a scene from Green Book, and I looked at the way that the anti-racist white hero in film is extremely problematic to understanding representations of race. I thought that it would be really interesting to look at movies because they are such an important fact of American culture. And so I didn't realize how many people actually go to the movies until I found some statistics from the Motion Picture Association. But ultimately, 3/4 of the US and Canada population in 2019, that's about 268 million people, went to the movies at least once. And also, another kind of key fact that I thought was really interesting was that there were 1.2 billion movie tickets bought in 2019. And so that just shows the impact that movies have on people, and it kind of shows the power behind the film industry. People really want to go see movies, so there's a demand, and ultimately there's going to be a supply for them. As movies are extremely important in American culture, it's also kind of critical to understand that American culture itself, just like the movie industry, is extremely diverse. So there needs to be a wide representation of various identities within films. And there are a pretty good amount of representations of Black and white race relations in film. I wanted to focus on this specifically because I am focusing a lot on the anti-racist white hero trope and film genre. So one of the ways that representations kind of function in films is that they can be extremely stereotypical, right? Like, Black people are oftentimes portrayed as being criminals, or they are poor, or they are unhealthy. And white people, a lot of the times, are often portrayed as being good characters. They're usually affluent or middle class, and typically they're pretty healthy. But it's important also to consider the ways that representations have functioned throughout history, and how film adaptations of history can really be impacted by representations of race. So what is being left out and what is being incorporated in these representations of history, and how does that impact one's understanding of race relations in the US as a whole? I definitely think that the film industry is making gains in diversifying their representations of certain groups of people, but I also feel like there are very specific tropes that the film industry has relied on for many, many years to continue oppressing certain groups of people. And one of the ways that I think the film industry does this is by incorporating the anti-racist white hero into primarily Black storylines. So basically this term was brought up by Kelly J. Madison, who is a scholar, and there are multiple aspects to the anti-racist white hero sort of film, but the character itself is usually a white savior. And that's a term that I'm sure most of you probably know, but white saviors in films have been around since the beginning of film, really. One of the first films that employed this sort of character is To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962, and this character even still exists today in film, for example, in the Green Book. And so ultimately what this character does is it helps white audiences identify with a character in a film about a Black storyline. Without this character, white audiences may feel uncomfortable watching a story. They may not feel connected to the racist white characters in the film. So ultimately, these sort of characters are critical to white people's receptions of these films. So when thinking about the ways that white audiences are catered to in the film industry, it's definitely important to kind of think about the ways that certain films about true stories are constructed and the ways that true stories may be manipulated for the purposes of having white audiences feel comfortable while viewing this specific film. And so I chose to focus on two films. I analyzed a scene from The Blindside and a scene from Green Book, and ultimately these scenes highlight the ways that the anti-racist white hero character in film is being portrayed in true stories. So I first focused on Green Book. I analyzed the relationship between Tony Vallelonga and Don Shirley. Don Shirley hires Vallelonga as his bodyguard while he tours the South during Jim Crow era. So obviously there's an initial threat to Shirley's well-being, and Vallelonga is kind of pinned as a racist character in the beginning, but ultimately, right within the first few scenes, there's foreshadowing of his character change. And the scene that I chose to analyze is basically kind of in the middle of the film, middle end, and Vallelonga and Shirley are at dinner at a restaurant where Shirley's going to perform. It's in Alabama, and basically in this scene, the power dynamics between the two characters is extremely important in understanding the ways that the anti-racist white hero character functions in film. Shirley starts off very in control of his own decisions. He says, "I will not perform if you do not let me eat here. I will not eat in the closet. I will not. And ultimately, the restaurant owner pulls Vallelonga aside and says, "Look, I will bribe you to get him to play, but he's not eating here." And this removes the power from Shirley and puts the power into Vallelonga's hands. Vallelonga then makes the decision that Shirley is going to eat somewhere else and not perform at this place, but it shows that Shirley himself could not get himself out of this situation, and Vallelonga then becomes symbolic of the hero in this situation because he made the right choice for Shirley not to eat at this racist establishment and not to perform at this racist establishment that continues to oppress Shirley in a way that Vallelonga then is clearly trying to say is wrong. So the second film that I wanted to analyze is The Blindside. I've always really liked this film, but ever since taking this film course on race, I really looked at it in a different light. I thought that Leanne Tui was such a great mother for wanting to help Big Mike and kind of change his story. But when I look at it now, I see that it is very much a Black storyline that puts a white character on a pedestal for helping the Black character. And that is what makes this film very white saviory, and it also falls into the anti-racist white hero category. So the scene that I chose to analyze is where Leanne Tui is at brunch with her affluent friends, and she says that she's going to adopt Big Mike. And her friends don't understand. They don't get it at all. And ultimately, Leanne Tui says, look, it's the right thing to do. This is what I'm going to do. And all of her friends kind of back off and say, well, we're sorry. Like, we didn't realize that this is exactly what you wanted to do. But it ultimately makes Leanne more of an important character than it does even Mike. And the story is about him. And that's the unfortunate side of having these anti-racist white heroes in films, is that a lot is lost in the storyline of the Black character. And a lot of the times the story is about the Black character. So it's kind of unfortunate that we see this happening in these types of films. But these films are also a reflection of issues within the Academy as a whole. It's kind of interesting, but in both of these films, the people who won awards were not the Black characters whose story is being represented in these films. Bala Longa, I think, won Best Supporting Actor, and Leanne Tui won Best Female Actor for The Blindside. So it goes to show that these films reflect a lot of the issues in present-day society, and it's kind of important to consider, where do we go from here with these representations? How can we improve these representations? And ultimately, the way that you do that is valuing Black history and Black storylines, because they do matter, and it makes a difference in film if these stories are being represented accurately and are putting importance on the characters in which they are trying to represent.